So this is chapter 10, recording 1. You'll notice that the slides do look a little bit different. I've decided to switch over to the focus slides rather than the comprehensive, so you guys have these to study with as well. But it takes out a lot of the extra stuff. So the primary component of caring for patients, that first thing that we're going to worry about is airway. We have to make sure that they actually have a way to get the air in and out, because if they don't, they die. As soon as you can't get oxygen in, all of that exchange stops, and then tissues become compromised. They start to die off. Here's the basic anatomy of the respiratory system. We did go over it, but just to give you another glance at it again. When you don't have, excuse me, adequate oxygenation, your vital organs, such as the heart and brain, are not going to function normally. Brain tissue begins to die within 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen. So it's very imperative that we take care of the airway, and then we focus on breathing, and then we focus on circulation. That primary assessment deals with life threats, namely the ABCs. So we've already talked about the airway overall. The upper airway starts with the nose, mouth, goes down to the pharynx and ends at the larynx, or where your voice box is. The main function is to warm, filter, and humidify air as it enters the body. Here's an overall look of your pharynx. You have your nasopharynx there at the top. It's behind your nose. You have your oropharynx, which is behind your mouth, and then your laryngopharynx, which includes the bottom portion of the pharynx and the top portion of the larynx. Nasopharynx filters and dust particles out because you have little tiny hairs and mucus within your nose. Oropharynx is just the posterior portion of the oral cavity. That's where your uvula is, or where that little hangy down thing is in the back of your throat that can stimulate your gag reflex. Your larynx has several different components to it. Cartilage, you have ligaments, and this kind of is the separation point between the upper and lower airway. You have two major cartilages. You've got the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. The thyroid is much bigger. This is your Adam's apple. Cricoid is down below that. You also have your hyoid bone, which is the only bone that's not connected to another bone in your body. So that's kind of a cool little fact. It facilitates swallowing. The anatomy of the lower airway, this is the trachea, bronchi, and then every structure within the lungs themselves. Their whole job is to take air and then exchange it with the blood. The trachea is that main tube that comes down, divides into two different branches at the carina. Your bronchi then branch out throughout your lungs, creating tree-like structures because there's several different branches, and this helps distribute oxygen throughout your lungs. So you can kind of see that picture there. The dome shape that's sitting underneath of both of the lungs, that's your diaphragm. That's what actually facilitates you being able to take a breath in. Your bronchioles have smooth muscle within them, so they can dilate or constrict, so get bigger or get smaller as oxygen passes through them. The smallest of the bronchioles is connected to the alveoli. Those are little sacs of, they're kind of balloon-like sacs, and those are super thin, and they're what allow for the diffusion of oxygen from the lung into the blood. Here's kind of how the cardiovascular and respiratory systems intertwine. Your heart pumps blood that does not have oxygen in it, so it's deoxygenated blood, out to the lungs. Around those little sacs of alveoli, you have capillaries, which are single-walled blood vessels, and it allows for material to flow across so it can exchange. The point of the respiratory and cardiovascular systems to work together is to remove carbon dioxide and other waste products from the cell, and then to deliver oxygen and nutrients back into those cells. There's a couple of different portions to breathing. We've been told that breathing is respiration, which is not actually true. The physical, mechanical act of moving air in and out of the lungs is actually termed as ventilation. Oxygenation is taking oxygen and actually binding it to those hemoglobin molecules within the bloodstream. When we're talking about oxygen saturation, that's the percentage of hemoglobin that actually has oxygen molecules bound to it. We want to try and keep our patients up above 94%. Respiration is that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the cellular level. So ventilation is that moving air in and out of the lungs. What this is trying to show you on the screen here is how air gets in based on muscular contraction. So we've talked about this before, but your lungs are essentially like balloons that are inside of a vacuum. When you pull down on the bottom of that vacuum by contracting the diaphragm, it creates this big, empty, negative space. And so it wants to pull air into it to try and fill that out. It's trying to equalize the pressure from outside of the body and inside of the lung cavity. When your diaphragm relaxes and comes back up to normal position, now all of a sudden that thoracic cavity has a lot more pressure in it than does the outside air. And so it's trying to force that air out in order to equalize the pressures. Along with your diaphragm, you have intercostal muscles that contract as well to lift your rib cage up away from your lungs, again, helping with that negative pressure within the chest. The whole point of ventilation is to get oxygen in. So we're trying to draw air in all the way down to the alveoli so that it can actually exchange. The oxygen within your lungs is going to move into the bloodstream because of something called partial pressures. You've got a certain amount of gas, oxygen gas in the air, and you have a certain amount that's dissolved in your blood. What your body is going to try and do is find that middle ground. So your blood at your lungs has very little oxygen in it. The air that you're breathing in has significantly more oxygen. They each have a measurement called partial pressure. What your body wants to do is switch those materials across their membrane to try and balance out their partial pressures. So you have really high partial pressure of oxygen in the lung, really, really low partial pressure of oxygen in the blood. So your lungs are going to end up trying to push oxygen out into that blood, dropping its partial pressure. Your blood wants to accept that oxygen to raise its partial pressure until they're almost equal. Carbon dioxide does the same exact thing. In your blood coming back to your lungs, you have relatively high partial pressure of carbon dioxide because it's picked up all of that waste material from your cells. In the air that we're breathing, there's a significantly lower partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So now your blood is readily pushing that carbon dioxide into your lungs, trying to balance out those pressures. Exhalation is a very passive process, meaning that it doesn't take energy. In order to contract your diaphragm to start your inhalation, it's active. It takes energy. We're actually contracting a muscle. To relax it doesn't take any energy. So it ends up shrinking the amount of volume that you have in that thoracic cavity, meaning that all of a sudden the pressure just went way up. And so in order to balance that with the outside world, you're going to go ahead and breathe out, push that air out of your lungs. Your regulation of ventilation, or what actually makes you breathe, has a lot of different receptors and feedback loops that sense the concentration of gas within the body. So you've got a couple of different receptors. They're called chemoreceptors, and they actually monitor your blood for different partial pressures. When those partial pressures get out of whack, when those concentrations get out of whack, your body decides that it needs to change what it's doing in order to fix that. So when your body is demanding a certain amount of oxygen and your blood doesn't have the right amount of oxygen, you have a condition that's called hypoxia. Hypo meaning low, oxia meaning oxygen. When your cells don't get enough oxygen, they start to freak out. If that continues, those cells are actually going to start to die. Most drive to breathe is going to be based on what's called pH. So the more CO2 that you have within your body, the lower your pH is. So it's actually CO2 within your body is essentially similar to an acid. Your body doesn't like to be acidic at all. So what you end up doing is you breathe faster. You're going to breathe faster, you're going to breathe a little bit deeper to try and blow off that extra CO2 so that your body isn't quite as acidic. Oxygenation, we've already talked about. Excuse me. That's the process of actually loading oxygen molecules onto those hemoglobin molecules so that you get oxygen within your bloodstream. This allows you to take oxygen out to the body and drop it off to the tissues, which they need. You have to have oxygenation for respiration to occur. You have to have ventilation to get oxygenation. So it's a cascade effect. You bring the air in, you bring the oxygen in, then you actually have to put it on the hemoglobin molecules, meaning that it has to actually exchange into the blood and attach in order for respiration to occur. If you have ventilation, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll have oxygenation. Just moving air in and out of the lungs is not enough. So there are spaces where oxygen levels are extremely low. So mines can find spaces, and the person can be breathing plenty, but not pulling in the right amount of oxygen. So they're not actually going to be able to survive. So being buried alive, for example, there's a set amount of oxygen in the space that you're in. Once you use it up, you end up suffocating because you don't have any more oxygen in that space. You can be ventilating all you want, but there's no actual oxygen to help keep your metabolic processes going. Respiration is that final step. This is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the alveoli and then also in the tissues throughout the body. This is how you actually keep your body running. You have to have sugar and you have to have oxygen in order for your body to run. We'll go ahead and stop here and continue on in the next video.